For me, Hoodoo is an American folk spiritual practice that is fundamentally concerned about the preservation of self, family, and community. So everything that Hoodoo does, its tools, its approach, its way of doing what it does is primarily to that effect.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander Eth, and today we are so honored to talk about Hoodoo, Rootwork, and Conjure with Reverend Dr. Aaron Davis. What is Hoodoo? And where did the roots of this distinctly American spiritual practice come from? How can we develop a relationship with herbs and plants and learn from them in our practice? How is Hoodoo flexible and adaptable since it is not initiation-based? Well, the perfect person to ask is our guest today, Reverend Dr. Aaron Davis. Now, Aaron is a native son of New York State, and he's been called to Christian ministry since 1996. Also during that time, the call of Aaron's ancestors grew. His Christian faith began to feel incomplete, only acknowledging the role of the saints once a year. And so this began another spiritual journey, and Aaron eventually found his ancestral home in the African-derived tradition of Lukumi and the related practice of Espiritismo. These traditions made the real ancestral connection and also taught a healthy reverence for all the forces of nature known as Orisha. Life took on a new meaning as Aaron learned about his ancestors and spiritual birthright, and one birthright was discovering that Hoodoo was in his blood. Working the work gives Aaron joy, purpose, and a sense of fulfillment as people attain relief from their conditions. And finally, by prayer, laying on of hands, and calling the Holy Spirit, Aaron was made bishop of the Renewal Church, or TRC. Aaron also began to discern, leading up to his consecration, the presence of a Cyprianic spirit in the lineage of Cyprian of Antioch. And Aaron has also spent many years as a clergy person and as a hospice chaplain for the last decade, spending time with people as they transition to ancestorhood. And so in this podcast, Aaron joins us to share about the practice of Hoodoo, the power of herbology, and how Aaron's presenting all of this in a new course through the Blackthorn School called Working the Roots, an Introduction to Rootwork. I also want to thank each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon for your support of the podcast, which without it would not exist, and also for asking Aaron your excellent listener questions. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome Reverend Dr. Aaron Davis. Reverend Dr. Aaron Davis, thank you so much for stopping by the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm so excited to be here, and I am also a huge fan. I've been listening to you for a while, and every interview that you do always blows me away. There are people who you have interviewed that I have studied with myself. So I can always say that this podcast, among a few others, is really top notch. I'm just grateful to have this opportunity to be with you today.
I must say, not only is the honor mine, but I become a huge fan of yours by being lucky enough to be one of your students in the Working the Roots course, an introduction to rootwork as well, which I'm very much looking forward to getting into. And in fact, Aaron, you opened the course talking about the importance of this term, social location, which was one of the first times that I really heard this term. For the listeners out there, can you share about what is social location and why is it so important for us to connect with our own roots?
Great question. So this term it's kind of a highbrow academic term that I learned when I was in seminary, what seems like forever ago now. And the idea of it basically is that we come from somewhere. We didn't just kind of appear out of thin air and then, lived our adult lives and so forth. We actually come from somewhere. We come from a place. We come from a family. We have a mother and father, regardless of how the relationship is, it took a mother and father to bring us into the world. And all of those things of our background and social location, it frames so much of how we see the world, how we walk in the world, how we make decisions, what we consider to be right and wrong, good and evil, all of those things. And so I start with that in the course because I've had a concern taking the other Hoodoo and Rootwork courses from other people that there are many courses out there to me that are great with educating you on the tools of Hoodoo, candles, herbs, so on and so forth. But they're really poor to me around connecting those tools with the practice and then connecting the practice with the context. And what that can result in is what a lot of people detest, both white and of color, of cultural appropriation. We hear that word thrown around a lot, or cultural misappropriation. And there is a truth to it. I've seen it myself. And when I look at it more closely, the common denominator for me is that people either are not aware of or don't care to be aware of the context from which they received whatever they received from a tradition like Hoodoo. They just kind of grab willy-nilly, throw it all together, claim it's their own practice, and kind of move forward. But then what happens is when you get someone like me, when you get a more traditional Hoodoo practitioner, ceremonial magician, whatever it is that's more traditional, and they see a person doing that, at the least will think that they're kind of foolish. But at the most, it feels very disrespectful. It's like coming into somebody's house and, cracking open their refrigerator and pulling out a beer and a sandwich. And, they don't know you, you don't know them. You haven't established the protocol for walking up in their house like that. And, more than likely it's going to result in a fight or the police getting called, right? Same idea. So we start with social location because I don't want people, it's really the only way that I can think of to get a group of people who come from all kinds of backgrounds. And you've seen this yourself, Alex, in the class. We literally in that class have people from Europe, parts of Asia, America, all over the place. I mean, we have Canada, we have people from all over. And there's no way, you can't police people. I don't really believe in policing people either. But I do believe in saying, let's talk about social location and what our ethics is. And in Hoodoo, there is no one way of doing ethics either. But I think that it's still a conversation that a community that's gathering to learn and study should have of what is right and wrong. Where are the boundaries? What is the consequence of me doing this kind of working versus that kind of working? When do I do this? When do I do that? How far do I go? These are all the questions that I'm constantly in conversation with my own elders about. So I start and continue because it's not just that first class, like social location and naming who you are, and where you're coming from is a constant thread from beginning to the end of the course. Because I really want people to take that seriously. I also know that there are, and this is the other reason why I start with social location, there are people who, primarily white people, Euro-American, Europeans, who I've been told have a great reluctance taking Hoodoo courses, Rootwork courses, because they've always been kind of made to feel like, for example, it's a Black thing. You're not supposed to be here. There's no real room for you here. You have your own stuff. Go do that pagan, Wiccan, New Agey stuff over there, but leave our stuff alone. I hear that. I understand it. I get it. I know my own history, especially in America. So I understand why there are certain people of color who feel that way. I don't, because I know the history of Hoodoo generally, and I know that part of what enabled it to survive, thrive, and continue to evolve to the present day is the fact that people of multiple ethnicities who came to this country or were here already, they essentially over time worked together to make contributions to what we have as Hoodoo today. So that is why I continue to say this is a truly American spiritual folk practice There's a couple of others, but really not that many that we can point to and say are American. And this is really an American one because many, many people over time have touched it and contributed something significant to it in a way. So part of the other reason why I start with social location is for those people who I just named who feel that kind of uneasiness of walking into the space, that they can feel less uneasy. Because as you saw, I invited everyone, including myself, to tell at least a chunk of your personal story around your spirituality so that people can see, whoa, actually, I don't have African-American blood, but I have this and that and this, and I'm doing this course and I'm seeing that this group of people, the Jews over here, they did this, and I have Jewish ancestry. So, wow, I actually have a point of intersection with this. Or, I come from a line of cunning women back from England. And that's, while it's not the same tradition, it's pretty darn similar. If you take the Cunning Man books that we have right now and line those up with Hoodoo books, you won't even always be able to tell the difference between the two traditions because they're both folk magic. They're both folk practices that borrowed from different pieces of whatever was around and made this other kind of for the people magical tradition in different parts of the world. It's really all over. It may look very different. It may have a different name, but that impulse for the people to take aspects of the religions around them and combine that with, the folk practices, herbal practices, and so forth that they know, it's fairly universal. It's fairly universal. I don't even really know of a part of the world where it hasn't had that at some point, even if the people as a whole have moved away from it. If you scratch and dig, you'll find it. So all of that is to say that the social location emphasis is to ground all of us. It's to ground the conversation. It's to ground any sort of uneasiness we may feel studying Hoodoo. And also it's to ground us as a community. It's a lot easier to work together with people when you feel like you kind of know them a little bit, when you feel like you kind of understand or have an understanding of where they're coming from. And even some of what they're struggling with. I mean, I'm sure you've seen it. People have left messages about things that they're struggling with, not so much with the class material, but in their lives. And then that actually can become a part of our class conversation and lead us into all other kinds of different directions. So I just think it's a powerful starting point. I don't see a lot of other folk magic classes starting there. So that's why I decided to do it.
Aaron, too, that actually leads to your own social location. I think I know myself, and I know many listeners would be interested in, how did you first become interested in rootworking and in Hoodoo? And also as someone growing up and attending the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, or the AME Zion Church, how did all of these influences lead to your interest in Hoodoo and rootworking? Great question.
So I'm sure some people, even when they look at this interview or even the summary of the interview, they're probably going, huh? How is that possible? Because we have been taught and really indoctrinated, whether we're Christian or not, that Christianity and really Abrahamic traditions in general are kind of like, if you're a Muslim, if you're a Jew, if you're some kind of Christian, that you are that and you can't be anything else. Of course, we know historically that that's just not true. You can look in those three different general religious cultures and you can see all kinds of exceptions to that. But that is still very much an understanding. Even among a lot of African-American people, it's changing, especially with the younger, newer generations. But certainly with the older ones, that is very much the case, even down to music. I definitely grew up with people saying repeatedly that if you have a gift for music, you got to make a choice. Either you sing for the church or you sing in the clubs, but you can't do both. I heard that a lot because I have family actually who were super talented with the voice in particular. And there's a couple of family members who did do both. And I remember them, even when I was a little kid, just always kind of being given a hard time by the family because they were in both worlds. But, with Hoodoo, all that gets kind of turned on its head. So back to your question. I digressed a little bit. Back to your question. I ended up here because in addition to being Amy Zion, I also was raised in the National Baptist tradition, which is similar to the Baptist tradition that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was a part of, but it's actually a more conservative branch. So I grew up in both of them, and they both have a really potent spirituality, particularly around personal development, devotional life. In the Amy Zion Church, for example, several years, almost every year, my father and we would make pilgrimages to Harriet Tubman's home in Auburn, New York. And that was a really big deal in the Amy Zion Church. I'm sure it still is, where big chunks of the church that are in New York, particularly upstate New York, would gather in Auburn and have church and other rituals on that property. But then they would go to her grave, and the Black Boy Scout group would come, and there was a lot of pageantry and fanfare. But what that kind of introduced into my spirit, into my soul, was the whole idea of venerating ancestors, because that's really what we were doing. That's really what we were doing. Every time I look back and I think about those times, and I think about sitting in church with my father, or sitting in church because he was often singing in the chorale, the big mass choir. The Amy Zion Church is one of the few Black churches that still sings Negro spirituals or slave spiritual. So I grew up hearing those, and not only hearing them, but hearing them in the context of this ancestor veneration, and feeling certain things moving in my spirit as they're singing these songs that my enslaved forebears also sang. And many of the people who were there, their ancestors also sang, and feeling deeply moved. Or later, when I was in seminary, and I actually took a pilgrimage trip to New York City to go to Mother Zion, the flagship church, and going down into the crypt where James Varick, one of the founding fathers of that tradition, he buried and interred in that church. And this is not a Catholic tradition at all, right? It's kind of almost quasi Anglo-Catholic-ish Methodist, because if you put Amy Zion next to what's called United Methodist today, United Methodists seem a lot more like mainline Protestant, but there's a lot of stuff in Amy Zion that is would look high church to people. So I'm in this crypt, and I actually kneel and start praying at the crypt. And I'm praying to him. I'm not praying to Jesus. I'm not praying to God. I'm praying to him and asking him to bless my spiritual journey of answering my call to Christian ministry. So that was really the second time that I was strongly practicing ancestor veneration. And then I would say, even before all of that, when I was in college, I had a professor who taught, he was a professor of religion. I was a religion major, and he taught several classes on all things African Christianity, African Islam, traditional African religion, African politics. And taking those courses, particularly the ones on traditional religion, when we're studying that stuff, like I think it's Facing Mount Kenya by Jomo Kenyatta, one of the books that we read, that book really moved me, because Dr. Kenyatta goes into detail about some of the traditional practices of his people. And then we're engaging this material in class. And I remember then making a mental note of saying, you know what, I like being Christian, I love Jesus and all of that, but I need to find my way to my ancestors, because this Christian thing really it's not speaking to that. The Protestant Christian spiritual ethic is really to acknowledge the dead, or what we call the saints. And in the Protestant world, saints are not just, St. Jude, Santa Barbara, and people like that. The saints are everybody, really. That's one of the differences between Catholic and Protestant spirituality. But the unfortunate consequence of that is we really only talk about ancestors once a year, usually in November, on All Saints' Day, the end of October and November. While that day is always meaningful to me, it was definitely not enough. And so I knew back then that I was going to find my way. So over the years, I explored different traditions that I could find, including some of the Afrocentric Kemetic traditions that are out there. And even just passed away, Maladomas Wame, he is a Dagra elder, or was a Dagra elder. He recently passed away. And he also created a global tradition where people connect to him and his people and go through initiations and so forth. And I actually started to try that as well. I had a number of really powerful experiences working with one of his elders here in America. But something always kind of stopped me, because there's kind of a point of no return with indigenous traditions where you take the step to get initiated fully, particularly if there's any kind of a priesthood. And whenever I got to that point in these other traditions, I just kind of felt like, no, that's not really for me. There's something that's stopping me. And I listened to that. I listened to that intuitive part of me. You know, fast forward a few years later, I did eventually find my way into the Lukumi tradition, meeting people who were connected to it and involved in it out in the California area. And that was where I found the deep resonance, because this tradition goes very deep. When you go for a reading called the Karakol reading in the Lukumi side, when you go for that reading, the reader will tell you things about yourself that you might know, but nobody else knows. I remember the first reading I got, the person was telling me stuff that I told nobody else. And that just kind of blew me away. You will learn about the spirits that walk with you and why they walk with you and the thing they've been doing before you even came in the tradition to really have your back. For me, that shifted my sense of reality, like being in the Matrix and taking the red pill. You know, it just kind of opened my eyes. And over time, it deepened my faith as I came to really understand how these pieces work together and come together in a really powerful way. So then the Hoodoo part came, because part of my particular Ile or spiritual house within Lukumi also practices Espiritismo, as you noted in the beginning. In short, that is a kind of Afro-Cuban style of spiritualism, where you primarily work with spirits of the dead, ancestral spirits. We gather in these seance-like meetings called misas, and that's where over time you learn about your ancestors, your spirit guides, who's walking with you, why they're walking with you, what their purpose is, and for you, how to work with those spirits. And so it eventually came up, and I heard like little whisperings of this growing up and into my adulthood. But as many people I'm sure knows, sometimes with elders, it's like pulling their teeth to get them to talk about, you know, ancestry and background and why certain things happen in the family, especially if there's anything shameful around it. And it's definitely that way with a big part of my family and the elders in my family. But it actually came up in the Misa that, you know, I have this connection to Hoodoo, to Rootwork, and that I could develop it even more, even with what's happened in my family. That's not really stopping me from exploring it, that I can explore it and the spirits will support that exploration. And that's pretty much what happened. I've explored it. I asked more questions of my family, got a lot of confirmation about that. And then since then, I just, you know, continue to learn and study and explore. But all that said, as wonderful as that sounds, it's not easy to reconnect something that was broken. It's not. Even something like Hoodoo, you know, people are teaching these courses, but they can't really, if you had it in your ancestry and your family doesn't practice it anymore, what you are learning from someone else is not traditional in the sense that it got passed to you from one family member to another to you. You're learning something. And so I call this, my coin of it is traditionalist, meaning like many of the teachers that I had that, you know, you learn as much traditional stuff as you can, but you also recognize at points that either parts of the tradition were lost or disrupted or fractured. And so then that teacher had to kind of reconstitute whatever that is to the best of their ability. And so it's my own attempt to be honest about that and to not kind of claim something that I don't really think is possible for me, at least. You know, I don't come from that kind of a family background. And really, that's what Hoodoo is to me. Yes, it has a strong traditional base, but, you know, root workers don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. They also don't get stuck on tradition. You know, they will innovate. They will jazz it out, as I say. You know, they will shift and change whatever needs to shift and change to make it work. They will use what they had. They don't go on, you know, long involved quests for any holy grails. They'll use the cup that's right there and they'll make that the holy grail. So all of that appeals to me. all that appeals to me. And it's also what I'm trying to convey, as a teacher now myself, to really empower people in that regard.
That's fascinating, Aaron, because it sounds like that as you teach, as you share, and as you go on this own journey, as you mentioned, with ancestral veneration and reconnecting with your roots, that in a way, this seems like it's also a personal quest for you in terms of reestablishing that link and connection to Hoodoo practice with your own ancestors. It's about healing, and it's about bridging that divide over space-time in a way. Would that be somewhat fair?
Very fair, very accurate. And because I'm not just a Hoodoo practitioner, but I'm a santero and espiritista, I'm also very clear that spiritual practices that I do outside of that tradition, 90%, most of them are also my way of honoring my ancestors and the ancestral spirit guides I have that come from those places, who have given me blessings over time to explore those things. So I know that every time I do something related to Hoodoo for myself or for someone else, or, someone I love or the community, I'm honoring them, and I work with them. I'm not just doing this stuff all by myself. If someone comes to me for a reading, more than likely I'm working with one of my root working spirits, in my family line. And so I will be in conversation with them as well as the client. So they're guiding what I'm doing, and they say yes to this, no to that. We know how to do it like this, but do this a little bit differently here. And I trust that, because I'm not going to sit there and say, well, why are you telling me to do that? That doesn't make sense, because I've already seen that when I do what they say to do, the person gets the results that they need. And I know that is pretty much how root workers of old did it too, whether they worked with an ancestral spirit or, they were kind of in a very prayerful state with God or Jesus Christ or, Mother Mary, if they're more of a Catholic worker. There's many different ways to do it. Yes, that's, very, very, very powerful for me. It's another kind of indirect form of ancestor veneration.
You have such a wonderful presentation, Aaron, about the history of Hoodoo. Can you give some of the listeners out there who might be hearing about the history for the first time, what are the roots of Hoodoo, as it stretches back in time to the Congo and after the injustice of slavery and all of the history of slavery in America? How did those roots from Africa take root here in America and change? Can you just give listeners some of the broad strokes?
Sure. I love that when you say give the broad strokes. And this is very broad, so I just want everybody to know that. There's probably going to be some stuff where you're going to say, why didn't he say that? It's just because it's just not coming to my mind right now. But that said, Hoodoo, at its core, it is African. So what does that mean? Most people who have studied slavery, doesn't matter what part of the world you're talking about, but any part of the world where slavery occurred, whether it's America, Cuba, Venezuela, Brazil, wherever it is, the slaves didn't all come from one country. Definitely didn't come from one tribe, but they didn't even come from one country. The forced migration of slaves happened kind of in stages. So the very first stage all over the world primarily were Congo people. They come from different tribes and places within the Congo. And so you can look, whether it's, like I said, Brazil, America, or whatever. And if you trace the ancestry, the majority of those earliest slaves came from the Congo. Then after that, Nigerians started coming. And so that's why if you look in most of these places around the world, you will see that in the earlier parts, that whatever the spirituality of the slaves was, it was very heavy duty Congo to start. And then usually if there were indigenous islanders, indigenous Indians, depending on what part of the world you're talking about, those two mixed and they created kind of a new spiritual tradition, kind of like Hoodoo, but much more spirit-based because all those different groups have their own spirits. In parts of the world outside of America, probably because of the, and I put this in quotes, flexibility of Catholicism, it was just a little easier for those enslaved people to still retain the spirits of their people. Although we know that a lot of the indigenous people in those places got wiped out for different reasons. But even there, the spirits of those people, even the indigenous people, were incorporated into a lot of these, what we call ADRs, African derived tradition. Then later the Nigerians come. And so that's when you start getting, the influence of the Orishas and kind of this different spiritual modality from the Congo side of things. The Congo tradition, while they all have an ancestor reverence component, the Congo tradition, like Vodun, is very ancestor focused. Even the nature spirits are strongly connected to the dead and to the world of the dead. And in some cases, those nature spirits were dead or human beings at some point too in those traditions. When you get the Nigerian stuff added to that, it's a little different. I mean, they have some of that too, but it's a little different. If you look at Brazil, for example, and I'm not even going to name them all. There's numerous spiritual and indigenous traditions there that have, adapted and evolved over time. But you can pretty much trace the timing of those adaptations to the influx of different, just in terms of slavery, different enslaved groups coming, and then how those groups influence the spirituality in that part of the world. Along with that was also the spiritualism. So that tended to come. My understanding is when the different European groups either were kicked out of Europe or chose to leave for whatever reason, they often brought their spirituality as well. So this is why in certain parts of the world, you'll see the spiritualism of Allan Kardec. You'll see sometimes the grimoire and ceremonial magic tradition, like the Solomonic magic. This is where you start to see all that stuff also getting mixed in. And it's because those people started migrating to so-called New World as well. Now, when you're talking about hoodoo in America, it's a whole other ballgame here. So same thing happened here where the enslaved people came from different tribes and countries. Same kind of thing where the first ones were Congo and so forth. But what was very different about America is because this country had a more Protestant influence, there was way less tolerance of both religious difference, but also the slaves continuing their practices. So here, for a very long time, the practice of those indigenous traditions could be met with extreme violence on the part of the slave owners and their watchdogs. So this is why, and not even talking about the indigenous stuff, let's just talk about the Christianity. I mean, this is why the slave would gather in the woods. This is why they would sometimes sing and pray to either God or to, maybe remnants of their memory of their indigenous African spirits. This is why they would pray to them in jugs of water so that their prayers couldn't be heard. But that's also really powerful for them to be praying into water, because water is a really powerful medium. And I know this from my Lukumi side. So they knew what they were doing. They were both hiding what they were doing, but also still doing it in a very powerful way. But there was way less tolerance. So this is why with hoodoo, even though it's African, it has that strong Congo basis, is why you won't see some of what you would kind of expect to see from Palo Mayombe, which is, one of the derived Congo traditions in places like Cuba. In that tradition, they still have the deities and the spirits from Africa that they call on that were lost here, because they got beaten out of them, basically, got beaten out of the slaves. So that is why hoodoo kind of replaced that with the Bible, biblical figures for Catholic saints. And then, of course, you have the unique places like Louisiana, where not only do you have the hoodoo aspect, but you have Vodun coming in. So the people there were able to also add the Loa and the other spirits of Haitian Vodun to their practice. And so that's why, they don't typically call it hoodoo there. It's called voodoo. And to me, it's kind of a combination of them both. That's kind of the basic history. It was very hard for African descendant people in America to practice anything that was like their indigenous practice, but they still did. They still found ways to do it from what they could remember. And then, of course, and again, these are very broad strokes, as those enslaved and then freed people start encountering other ethnic groups like Native Americans and First Nation people, encountering what I'll call the Indians, encountering them, then enabled those enslaved folks to start making the adaptations and adjustments of their herbology. For example, that there are certain herbs on the African side of things that you cannot get here. You know, you might be able to get some of them in Florida, but really nowhere else in the country. So they had to adapt. And in that interaction, that's where they learned some of the correspondences of like, oh, okay, this African herb that we used to use, we don't have it here, but this herb does the same thing. So now we're going to use this one because we can't get that one. You know, and that continued. That just continued. You know, I can go through every group. The Jewish community had a huge impact. You know, there are several hoodoo books, like the Master Book of Candle Burning, that I believe comes out of, I can't remember her name off the top of my head. The person who named on there is Henry Gamache, but that's actually like a pseudonym of a woman. I believe it's a Jewish woman. So there's that. There's, you know, the fact that a lot of the drugstores were owned by Jewish people, and those drugstores weren't like the drugstores we have of today. You know, you think of the civil rights period where you could go into a drugstore and sit down and have lunch, you know, as well as get your medicine, as well as, you know, get them to mix a powder for you for the whatever work you're going to be doing later on in the evening. So that community also went a long way to helping the evolution of hoodoo from a largely rural practice to an urban practice where, you know, it had to shift yet again. You know, the bathing practices that were done in the countryside can't really be done the same way in the city. So the tradition had to adapt to that. We can't sit in a basin anymore. Now we have a tub. What if we don't have a tub? We have a shower. So then, you know, you pour it over yourself. Okay. And then you catch some of it at your feet. Oh, okay. And so then, you know, it continued to adapt again. The influx of Asian people, you know, that also had an impact on it. You know, there are products like the Chinese wash, which is basically soap with lemon and lemongrass in it. You know, some of the spirit figures within the Asian tradition also became really important in things like prosperity work, like the Lucky Buddha, the Hotai. You know, so I can continue to point those out, but the point is that the different groups that came to America and became American themselves, they all started to contribute to this thing called hoodoo up into the present day, where now, even though there's not so much of an influx of different ethnic groups anymore, there are still different groups who are influencing hoodoo even now. And now you have hoodoo practitioners that, you know, combine their hoodoo with Hinduism and the deities of Hinduism, which those deities might seem strange to a traditional worker, but the impulse to bring those things together would not have seemed strange because they'd say, oh, well, even though I don't understand it all, I recognize it because I had to do the same thing. So adaptation and resilience, and as I continue to say, the one of the spiritual geniuses of African-American people is our ability to make our way out of no way with God's help. And that's shown in our spirituality and in our music and in other parts of our culture.
As you teach, Aaron, and as you interact with students, or as you interact with people who are just finding out about hoodoo for the first time, can you share about, like, what are some of the biggest misconceptions about hoodoo? And you've touched on this, like, oh, hoodoo, isn't that voodoo? Or hoodoo is, you know, Wicca, or hoodoo is initiation based. I mean, can you kind of dispel some of the biggest misconceptions out there?
Sure. And this is not in any particular order, but hoodoo is not initiatory at all. The only exception to that I can think of is if you come from a traditional hoodoo background. So again, remember I said earlier, what constitutes traditional for me, and other people may have a different definition, but my definition of that is there has to be a direct transference of tradition from someone in your family to yourself. And with the understanding that it's a family practice. It's not something that they learn from some random person like me, but actually something that grandma taught you, and now you're going to teach your daughter the same thing. So if you have that to me is it's close to an initiation in the sense that a person is looking at you and kind of making a decision that you've come to a certain point in your development as a human being that you're ready for that information. And they also want to give it to you before they die. But barring that, there is no initiatory rituals, rites, practice. You know, there's no gate that you have to step through also related to that, it is not a Black only thing. It's not just for African American people. The history of Hoodoo also shows that very clearly. So every time I hear people say it, I cringe a little bit because I feel like they don't really know the history of how Hoodoo both came to be, but continue to be. And to understand that, no, this is really a we're all in this together kind of thing, you know, because it took African Americans a while after slavery and Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction. It took us a while to get to the point where we could begin to have our own thing, you know, in terms of money, property, businesses, so on and so forth. And even when we did get them, as you see in the class, you know, even when we did get them, there were oftentimes violent backlashes against the African-American community where those things were literally destroyed. Just arbitrarily for no other reason than people were just jealous as can be and didn't like the fact that the Black community was beginning to really thrive. You know, there were a lot of monumental mountain-sized hurdles that we had to overcome as a group of people to be able to do that. And so as we were struggling with those things, some of these other groups did become involved in that in different ways. And that was one of the ways that the tradition was able to continue on. And I think that that really needs to be continually acknowledged by teachers, because we are living in a world, just talking about America, not even talking about the rest of the world. Just in America alone, we are living in a country where every day it's getting more and more polarized, more and more crazy, more and more kind of racially divided. And part of why it's easy to do that is because this country is piss poor. And you can put me on record. This country is piss poor at teaching the history as it actually was. And I don't just mean the bad thing that happened. I don't just mean that, because one of the things that has blown me away in studying American history is to learn that at every single point of oppression, of some group being oppressed in this country, there have always been people of whatever group, but let's just say white people. There's always been white people who have stood against that tide. Always, 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 always. They might have been a very small minority, but they did. And that witness to me is what gives me hope, that there's always people who will even stand against their own people when they want to be oppressive and hurt somebody else. But we don't know that unless we look or unless somebody brings that to our attention. So I make it very clear in my course that, you know, everybody is invited, because that's how it is. It's not a closed tradition. And you saw me talk about this too. And this is similar to the initiation idea, but, you know, a closed tradition is a tradition. It doesn't mean that it's closed off to people. It just means that that tradition requires you to go through some sort of initiatory step, like an ATR, like I'm just naming them, like Thelema, you know, the lodge magic groups, a lot of them have the same thing where you have to go through these formation steps to be able to practice, number one, but number two, to be able to advance in that tradition. And that's just how that's set up. And anybody who signs on to that understands that that's what it requires for you to do that. You know, and generally it doesn't go well if you have an issue with that and want to fight it, because that's what that tradition is. But Hoodoo is not that. Hoodoo is also not an African traditional religion. If anything, you could call it an African-derived tradition. So the difference for me is the traditional ones, much like I'm saying about traditional and traditionalist, the traditional ones have been able to retain who they are and how they practice without a lot of disruption. But the derived ones have not. So in Lucumí, for example, the start of Lucumí, when the enslaved people came to Cuba, you know, they had to hide a lot of what they did behind the Catholic saints. And the Europeans that were in charge in Cuba also created these, basically they're called cabildos, these Catholic social clubs that were they were identified with a particular saint. So, you know, it would be the club for St. Jude or the club for St. Barbara. And St. Barbara was understood to be a mask for Chongo, the Orisha of fire, thunder, and war. So when they were gathering to venerate Santa Barbara, they were actually venerating Chongo. And, you know, sometimes that meant that the fundamentals, the basic building blocks of drawing that Orisha energy down to earth were hidden in the statue. And then they would work with that Orisha in different ways there. But to do that, not anybody can do that. I mean, you have to align yourself with that nature force's energy so that you don't get messed up, and so that you're able to, in a way, control that energy so that it doesn't do crazy things to you or to the community. Hoodoo doesn't have any of that. There's no priesthood, there's no close anything unless people choose to close it. But that's not how it's traditionally practiced or historically practiced. There's a lot of claim of non-Black people practicing it, practicing cultural appropriation or misappropriation. And there can be truth to that, but Hoodoo itself is an appropriative tradition. Part of how it survived and adapted was to take this piece of ceremonial magic, take this piece of Jewish Kabbalah spirituality, take this piece of Asian ancestral reverence, and to pull those pieces together to fill in some of the gaps, but also not just to fill in the gaps, but to create a tradition that was versatile, that gives you options for how you deal with conditions and problems that happen in life. It's a folk tradition where there's no one way of doing anything. You can see this in the class where somebody will say, well, how do I do this work? I heard that it's supposed to be done like this, 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 and this. And I'm like, yeah, that's one way to do it, but you can also do this, 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 and that. And they're like, oh, wow, I didn't think about that. And I'm like, yeah, there's about 10 million ways to do the same thing. So if that appeals to people, people will really come in and work it. If it doesn't, they'll find a more traditional path, and that's okay.
Can you share with us then, what is Hoodoo broadly speaking? And I know that, for instance, herbology plays a huge central role, but if you were to share with someone for the first time hearing about Hoodoo, what the heart of Hoodoo is, what would come to mind?
I'll try to say this concisely, then I can unpack it if you want me to. For me, Hoodoo is an American folk spiritual practice that is fundamentally concerned about the preservation of self, family, and community. So everything that Hoodoo does, its tools, its approach, its way of doing what it does is primarily to that effect. I didn't go deep into this. I mean, we don't need to go super deep, but, because it was born out of American slavery, it has this seeming hard edge to it because, and I'm using a very harsh example, but if I'm a male slave and I have a wife and kids, and I can see that the slave master has his eye on my wife and even, does things to my wife that I don't want him to do, I'm not going to be happy about that. But as an enslaved man, I mean, what am I going to do? Am I going to go kill him? What's going to be the consequence of that? If I do that, then they're going to kill me, my family, or they'll kill me and my wife and they'll sell my kids off. So that's not really a viable option, at least not yet. So instead, what I do is I work the roots. I put stuff under his porch. So every day he steps out of his house, that thing I put under in the ground under his porch, late one night, every time he steps on it or over it, it pulls a little bit of his life force. And what it pulls from him, it uses to power itself and to keep powering itself until he starts getting really sick and nobody can figure out why. And then maybe I have one of the house slaves who knows what's going on. Maybe I have her slip something in his food. And the thing that she puts in there also starts to make him sick. Or maybe it makes him lose his nature, as we call it, which basically means his libido. So he not only is he sick, but he doesn't even have any sexual desire for my wife anymore. So problem solved. And then if need be, I will do something in terms of the Rootwork tradition. I'll do death magic. I'll do something to straight up kill him. But, I won't leave a trace. He's not going to see it coming, and neither will anybody else. And there is medicine where you can do that. So, some people are like, whoa, really? I don't know if I want to do that. That sounds so harsh. It's like, well, yeah, because it was a harsh world. We were being killed left and right. We weren't even seen as human at that point. We were property. So it created a self-fulfilling prophecy. It created a world that wasn't our world, but we were in it nevertheless. And it created a very brutal spirituality in certain ways, even though that's really not what the essence of it is about. The essence of it is really about healing, reconciliation, and keeping the family and the community together. So that's what I really tried to teach, to do.
To that point, one of the things I love about the class is you really start out by saying, look, before you go further into learning about the specific operations or procedures of a specific, hoodoo mojo hand or whatever's being taught, you really have students examine personal ethics. Why is it so important to examine personal ethics? And then you also introduce terms that I heard for the first time, like, are you a lady-hearted conjurer? Are you a are you a two-headed conjurer? And really examining where you're coming from.
So I think you need to have an ethical basis. And like I said in the beginning, there's not like like Christianity. Christianity is fairly clear about ethics, right and wrong. The 10 Commandments, God said, do this, not do that. We don't have it like that. So, and I know that. And really, in reality, Hoodoo, the ethics tends to be situational, meaning you respond spiritually with a working based on the circumstances and the condition that's presented to you as a worker. That said, you need to be clear. I need to be clear about what my personal ethic is, because people are going, if you get good at it and you also decide to help the community, you are going to have people come to you who are going to come to you with complex situations and even situations that might be morally ambiguous. For example, I had a client not too long ago who came for a reading. A friend of hers brought her, and she asked me basically to do what's called tying down her husband, which I generally don't do that kind of work. And I won't go too deep into why not, but I generally don't do that kind of work, in part, but not so much because I think it's wrong, but more because it's a lot of work. You're battling a person's will. And if you got to do all that to keep somebody, it's probably not worth it. But in this particular case, she made it clear that the reason she's asking for this, besides wanting to keep him, was because she was utterly dependent on him financially. So that's actually one of the exceptions that I make, where I do and would consider doing the work, because my parents were divorced. My mom was a single mom. And so I watched my mom struggle in those early years trying to take care of me and herself. And so I know how difficult that is when you don't have that. And it's even more so when you have a partner, but the person not contributing in that fashion like they should be. So I was aware of all that. So part of why I emphasize, the importance of a personal ethic is because, each of us has to have our ethics worked out enough so that when these situations come to us, we know what we are and are not willing to do. But also, we know our limit. So somebody could come to me with something that either I'm not willing to do, or I don't even know how to deal with that. But I know enough people in the community that I can say, hey, that's kind of beyond my pay grade. Why don't you give Alex a call? He's really good at this, that, and this. And I think he could help you with that better than me. And I'm not afraid to say that, because I'm not a master of everything. I'm not even a jack of all trades. I'm good at what I'm good at, and some other things, not so much. So it also requires you to be really honest with yourself, to continue to take a personal inventory, to continue to ask yourself, what is my motivation for doing this? And also to ask yourself, am I doing this because I have some of my own unresolved stuff that I'm working out through this client and their situation? That's really bad. That's really bad. And all these things that I'm talking about, these are the things that my own elders, we continually have conversations about it. We continually talk about how everything kind of comes back to you, to me, as the practitioner. Even when somebody's bringing something in their own life, there's probably an element of what they're coming to me with that has some relevance to me as well. So that's why I think having the ethics worked out is important. Now, of course, I'm not saying you need to have it worked out in a neat little box, because life isn't neat, but you need to know. Your second question about lady-hearted, two-headed, that term lady-hearted can sound very almost sexist, but it's not, as far as I know. It's just meant to designate a root worker who chooses not to engage in more baneful workings. And even within that category of so-called lady-hearted, there are different levels. So, if I'm lady-hearted, I might say, I don't do negative working except for situations of abuse or molestation, and then in those cases, I let it rip. But other than that, I'm not engaging in that stuff. You need to go down the street to Papa Joe and he'll help you out. Two-headed is what I identify myself as, and it's somebody who basically willing to work both hands, to use the Western occult designation of, left hand, right hand path. It's a root worker who's willing to do both good and not so good. But even within that, you have gradation. So you have some people who don't care about who they hurt, and they just go and do what they do. Consequences be damned. I'm not like that. I've always been taught by my elders and teachers to always practice restraint, to not bring, a bazooka to a knife fight, but just bring a knife and match the working to the level of the severity of the situation, not get out of control. Because the thing is when you're talking about spirits, even roots and herbs, those are spirits too. So, whatever spirits you're working with, if you go really crazy, you can get really crazy results when you don't need to do that. If you don't need to do that, why do all that? If it doesn't call for that, don't do it. So everybody has to make that choice. And of course, the choice you make today may not be the same one you make tomorrow. You could have experiences as a worker where you start off lady-hearted and then say, you know what? There's too much crazy stuff going on. I need to go the two-headed route. And that's okay. That just shows your own adaptation and growth over time with the practice.
Can you share about herbology and why is herbology and working with herbs and roots and plants, why is that one of the core hearts of hoodoo?
It's one of the places where you see a remnant in a survival, I guess you could say, of the African Congo side of it. Because, the way we work with the roots, the way the roots are deployed in all kinds of different things, from candle work to making a powder to our belief of what the root is, all that is very African, very Congo. So, for example, rosemary is not just rosemary. It's not just an herb. For me, it is an herb with a spirit within it. So when I'm working with it, and being prayerful, even if I'm not addressing that herb directly, I'm very conscious and aware that as I pray over it or pray the psalm over it or whatever I'm doing, that I am working with the spirit within that herb. And I can hold it in my hand and I can feel the energy of the spirit within that herb. And sometimes it will give guidance as I'm working with it as well. And so these are all possible things that root workers of any kind can experience depending on their particular relationship with a particular herb or root. We call the tradition root work. It's one of its informal names, I guess you could say, and that really emphasizes the centrality of herbs within it. And there's really nothing you do in hoodoo that doesn't include an herb at some point, whether it's dressing a candle, whether it's, making a mojo bag, whether it's creating a bath for yourself to cleanse or strengthen you, whether it's laying down protective barriers in or around your house. And all those things, we are using herbs, and not just using the herb, but really working with the spirit within the herb. And in some cases, and it sounds a little funny to say it this way, but, in some cases, we're almost creating a Frankenstein. When you make a mojo bag, it's not usually just one single herb. It's usually at least three on top of other curios and things you may put in the bag, and you put all that together and you pray over it and do other things to it. And you're creating an entity with all those entities kind of together to a particular purpose for you or another person. And that is powerful. To do that and then to see the effect it has for that person is powerful. Yeah, I'll leave it there. There's a lot more I could say, but that's, it's kind of it in a nutshell.
Aaron, we've also, to that exact point, have many listener questions for you, including this topic of herbology. And we have one for you from Daryl, who is asking, I am curious if Reverend Davis could share if Hoodoo adheres to an animistic or a pantheistic view of the universe and as one engages with herbs. Thank you so much, Daryl says.
That is quite a question. So sometimes I can't keep it straight in my head, animism, pantheism, all that. So, I'll do my best here and say, generally, yes, that there's elements of both of those. But I would say, and it almost feels like splitting hairs, I would say it's more panentheism because this is influenced by Abrahamic traditions. There is a God. Most of us recognize God through one or more of the Abrahamic tradition. And so God always remains God. And even when you understand, spirits and herbs and things are all manifestations of that one God, God is still, for me, and more personal. I wouldn't necessarily say this is all root work, but for me, God has both a transcendent and immanent quality. So, I can at times feel the presence of God when I'm doing work, particularly more positive work, like blessing someone or cleansing someone or making a bath or something like that. I can feel the presence of God around me and sometimes even in me as I'm doing that, even though I'm working with very earthy material things, to bring about a certain effect. But it's not like, the reason why I say not pantheism is just because my understanding of my read of pantheism is more that God or deity, we can even move away from the Abrahamic God, but deity is somehow that rock or that herb that I use. And that's not the understanding in Hoodoo, either in the Judeo-Christian aspects of it or in the African aspects. West African spiritualities are pretty clear that God is kind of separate and apart from those things. Even if there's aspects of God in them, the panentheism part, God is still apart from that stuff. The animism, I would say, comes in, kind of what I was saying earlier about things like the herbs, where the herb is not just an herb, but it's a spirit. And the gift and talent of a root worker is to know how to both talk to that spirit, that herbal spirit, but also to know how to awaken it and to work with it to accomplish a certain task or purpose.
In terms of building relationships, we have a listener question for you from Adrian Clark, who is asking, I would love to know the Reverend's perspective on building relationships with plant allies and the subject of ancestral plant relationships.
I'm not quite sure what they mean about that second part, but I'll try to take a stab of a guess. The first part, I think that is very much a part of Hoodoo. And even in the course, I don't know if you remember, but on the week that the lesson that we deal with herbs, one of the Hoodoo Hack homeworks is for people to find an herb near them in their house, around them, and just connect with it, connect with it in a way that works with them, and then to share that experience with the group. So, and other classes I've taken have done that too in some form or fashion, where you at some point have to work directly with a single herb and see what happens. And as you know, it's not always a positive thing. Sometimes you can discover that, a certain herb doesn't like you or agree with you, which, I remember the first time I experienced that, it kind of tickled me because I didn't even know that was possible, but it definitely is. So I think doing the work, working with herbs and roots is how that happens in Hoodoo. It's not like some Wiccan traditional witchcraft traditions I know of that have a very different way of interacting with plant allies, as the questioner said. It's not that formal or ritualized in Hoodoo, because Hoodoo, everybody's got to remember, Hoodoo is always practically oriented. There's not a lot of theurgy. I can't think of a better word. Not a lot of theurgy in Hoodoo. It's there, but that's really not the aim of more traditional historical Hoodoo.
Kind of following Adrian's question, when Adrian mentioned the subject of ancestral plant relationships, what I think of is, Reverend, have you ever seen a situation where, say, you have a very strong one-on-one connection with lavender or basil or mint, but then in your ancestral work, you find out that maybe there's a connection there where your great-great-grandmother and great-great have a connection to lavender, or something else.
Okay. Got it. Yes, there is definitely that. That's what he's talking about. I've encountered that. And that's actually when you do the ancestor work part. And again, there's no one way to do that either. But when you really connect and work with your ancestors and you combine that with hoodoo practice, that absolutely happens. And that's where you get it can almost seem weird because, like you'll take a class from me and I'm telling you, this is how you make a candle. This is how you use the herbs with the candle. This is, and I'm giving you this A to Z process. But then when you're connecting with your own ancestor, they're like, yeah, we know you know how to do it like that, but this is how I do it. And this is what works. So do it this way. Like, really? And they're like, yeah, man, I told you to do it this way. Why are you asking me again? And so then when you go and do it and it works better than what you thought you knew. And that's how they teach you. That's how your ancestors, that's how your spirits teach you. So yes, in that sense, absolutely. That is a big part of the ongoing mechanics of hoodoo and how you develop as a worker.
We always assume, oh, well, if I want to work with this spirit or if I want to conjure this spirit, then I can just do that. But one of the things you say, Aaron, over and over again is you need to find out if the roots or if the spirits of the roots and the herbs want to connect with you in the first place. And you actually tell kind of a very interesting story about an orris root when you were at a festival. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's two parts to answer that question. So yes, it still tickles me when I think about it. I actually gave that orris root to my girlfriend, and she had a better experience with it. So and that makes sense because if you understand what orris is, one of the properties of it is that it's really an herb. It's really a root that's for women and for the empowerment of women. So it makes sense to me that herb was a little like, I'm not really feeling. So I went to a festival. I got that root. It was like a pendulum, basically, that could they kind of drilled a hole in it and put a string on it because it is used that way sometimes. And when you get a pendulum of any sort, the first thing it's supposed to do is ask it, do you want to go home with me? And so, when I got that, I pulled it out of its little bag and I asked, and it was like, no. And so I was like, okay, well, do you want this? You want that? It's like, no. It just kept saying no over and over again. And then my girlfriend came over. And so then I said, sweetie, just do me a little favor. Hold this and see, just ask it if it wants to go home with you. And she did. And it was like, yes. So I just started laughing. I think I even tried to use it one time for something and it just didn't go well. So I was like, all right, I'm going to leave you alone. So that happened, it happened. And so that is why with the course, and even some of the other people I've learned from, we differ on this sometimes. There are people who don't think divination is very important or kind of almost dismiss it altogether. With hoodoo, I just don't think that's a great idea because we are talking about working with different kinds of spirits, not just like disembodied spirits, but like we're talking about right now, the spirit of herbs. And so, I don't know, unless I can feel it intuitively, I don't know if that orris root wants to actually work with me. I don't. So instead of just kind of blindly forcing it to work and then having everything go sideways and not really knowing why, I will ask. And not just for like if a herb or root agrees with me, but just because in hoodoo, there's several herbs that have several different properties and can be used several different ways. So even if you know different ways to work with herbs and configure things, you don't necessarily know if this herb or that herb is the better one to use for this particular working. So for me, I say it's better to be careful than foolish and to ask. You don't need to go through a complex ceremonial magic operation to ask that question. Just pull out a pendulum or whatever you use to get a simple yes/no answer and ask. If you have the connection to the herbs and roots you have, they will tell you. They'll tell you. And I think that's really important to have effective working practice that's able to get results. Because if you don't have a way to check and double check those things, you'll have a lot of hit and misses, and things will work sometimes and they won't work others because you haven't done the work to really see and know that this collection of herbs working in concert for you will produce the result you want. I don't know about you, Alex, I don't have time to waste. I don't have time to waste, brother. So if somebody's coming to me for help for something, I want to know that I can help them. So I'm going to use all the tools at my disposal to figure that out. And if I'm not the one to do it, then that's when I put my ego aside and refer them to someone else, because I want them to get relief from their condition and whatever is kind of causing problems in their life.
Another thing that you talk about as well, Aaron, that's so important, that's one of the cornerstones, if I may, of Hoodoo, is the importance of the Psalms. Can you share a little bit about why the Psalms are so important in working Hoodoo operations, rituals, everything related to that?
Absolutely. So several things I can say about that. One thing I want to say is, and I won't go too deep into this, but this is one of the places where Hoodoo and Solomonic / ceremonial magic have a common interest. As you know, at least from the way that I was taught by Father Aaron Leach, ceremonial magic for the purification that you need to do in the day of an operation, they're really, really important. Even in his class, the first time I did an angelic operation, I did that. I did exactly like he taught. And I had all kinds of wild experiences when I did that. Wild in the sense of positive, powerful experiences. And it was not easy, folks. It is not easy to go through ceremonial magic purifications because of all of the stuff that you're not doing, putting aside, and the fasting. It's just not easy. But what I found was the Psalms, it was like the Psalms were almost like a key that was unlocking the buildup of, I'll say, spiritual energy, or ache. All that spiritual energy that I had built up in the days leading up to that operation, you can feel it. Like you almost feel like you're in an altered state and you're building up. And then you take that final Solomonic bath and you're reciting numerous psalms as you're doing that. And something's happening to you. The energy that you built up is kind of unleashing and radiating. And then you step into that circle and you do whatever it is that you came there to do. Really powerful stuff. I would say it's very similar in Hoodoo, with the exception that the way Hoodoo works is we don't always do purification before working. The purification aspect usually comes after. Meaning, if I'm, God forbid, Alex, if I'm cursing you and I do a curse working against you, after I do that, I really should take a hyssop bath, where I have dried hyssop herb and, I boil it like a tea. And then I take the waters from that, I pray over them, pray numerous psalms over them. And then I purify myself afterward by taking that bath, much like the Solomonic bath. Now, the Psalms and Hoodoo, in many ways, the way I see them, being in the African-derived traditions I'm a part of, those traditions have very specific prayers that you learn. There's a core prayer in each one of them that you learn that's basically a prayer that calls on your ancestors. And then it calls usually on nature forces. And so you're calling on both of those sets of spirits together and then directing their energy to help you with a particular working that you're doing for yourself or for someone else. Well, Hoodoo didn't have that. At the beginning, it didn't have that because, as I said earlier, all that stuff was lost or disrupted. There are books that talk about it. Albert Rabbitoe, the late Dr. Albert Rabbitoe, he wrote a book called Slave Religion that I recommend everybody to read. And he kind of gives a survey of this spirituality that we're talking about today. And one of the things he said in there that there was I don't know if it was a journal recording or whatever, but somebody had this interview with a slave that they had done where the slave was talking about having an incus to do workings with. Now, that word incus basically was kind of a corruption of the word inkisi, which is the term used in Congo-derived spirituality or traditional Congo spirituality to talk about an object of power or a powerful spirit, and sometimes both, depending on what you're talking about. So that slave knew that it was an inkisi. He just didn't know how to actually say the African word anymore, probably because it was lost to him, or that, that was just kind of how the word changed once everything came here to America. So there were elements of it here, but like I said, a lot of that was lost, and just the environment in America was just too hostile, with the notable exception of places like Louisiana and the Sea Islands in the Carolinas, where the Gullah Geechee people are. Though that's the other place where there was more of that traditional, original Congo spirituality, or other versions of it were able to survive. The whole Bible really, but I would say particularly the Psalms, their replacement tool. So really the Bible became an Nkisi because although the African descendant people recognized that the Bible itself, not just the words within the text, but the Bible itself was a tool of power. And they knew from also, especially when Hoodoo evolved, as I talked about earlier. And so when the Jewish community started inserting their aspects of their spirituality into Hoodoo, that is also where the whole psalmic magical tradition within Hoodoo became a lot stronger. And I can't remember the name of it. It's Sefer Tehillim, something like that. But there's a particular Jewish Kabbalistic text that was put in I want to say the 6th and 7th books of Moses, which is also this kind of mishmash Jewish Kabbalistic or even pre-Kabbalistic text that was very popular in Hoodoo and in other parts of the world. And it was used by a lot of root workers. And within that text, there's this Sefer book that I can't remember the name of off the top of my head, that has a breakdown of all 150 Psalms and how you work with them, prayers you use with them, the number of times you recite the Psalm itself, because recitation is also a way to build power working with the Psalms, And I don't think I even said this a lot in the class. I'll make sure to say it. But, Psalm 23, I haven't memorized. And it's a stock psalm for me when I'm working to empower things the Hoodoo way. And I will sometimes pray that psalm repeatedly, not just one time, but I'll say it over and over and over and over again, because I know, I recognize, and I can feel the buildup of spiritual power as I'm saying those words over a newly made condition oil. And I know that's not a new thing. I'm sure there are many other workers who do the same thing. But you can look at this book that I'm talking about and there's a whole bunch of them, and there's so many that have different angles and emphases, but there's been a lot of books about how to work with the Psalms magically over the years. And so what I advise people to do is to get a few of them and study them and to see which one connects to you the most. I know the Sefer book that I'm referring to, that's one of the oldest ones. And I've used some of the suggested workings in there to good effect and different work things I've done before. That's how I see the Psalm. The Psalms are primarily a replacement tool, one of the ways for root workers to generate power in the way that they would have with the indigenous technology that they lost. Also, I think it's really, really, really important to say, because this has come up in my class as well, that, there are people for whom Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they just don't connect with it, don't like it. They're in their own kind of recovery from religious trauma, all of the above. But whatever their reason is, they really don't want to go there, but they still feel a draw to Hoodoo. So one of the things I know from my seminary studies is many of the Psalms, not all of them, but the vast majority of them are not even actually Jewish in the sense of their kind of origin story, that many of the Psalms come from different pagan groups that the Hebrew turned Jewish people encountered in the Middle East over time. And they incorporated those Psalms into their book of Psalms and basically swapped out the name of whatever deity for Yahweh, for, their understanding of God. So what I just try to remind people is you're actually in good company if you're a pagan, whatever, and you feel discomfort. Just know that these hymns, these poems, these praise songs, they used to be to other gods. And all they really did was swap out the name. And so for some people, that kind of helps to put it in a different They see it in a different light after that, and it's a little easier for them to work with it. And that's also what Hoodoo is about. You use what works for you. You do not have to be Christian to do it. You don't have to be Jewish to do it. You don't have to follow an Abrahamic faith. What I say is you just really need to respect the history, the context, and respect the fact that the Bible and the Psalms and so forth, that this is a part of the tradition. It's not going anywhere, because this is how those earliest root workers were able to access the power that was lost through the experience of slavery.
Psalms, they're so powerful. And to that point, we have another listener question for you from Bob Wilson, who is saying, I understand the importance of Psalms in this work, but Bob says, I haven't owned a Bible in years. And Bob's wondering, Reverend, if it's okay if Bob looks up the particular Psalm online, or if it's more powerful to read from an actual Bible. And if so, Bob's saying, should I get a new Bible? There are very cheap ones at used item stores, but you never know what energy might be attached to it. Or would a Psalter be okay? Any advice there, Reverend?
Yeah. So what I would say to my brother there is, do what works for you. Do what works for you. That is the heart of Hoodoo. So if you have a Bible, great. If you need to get one at the local dollar store, also great. If you're concerned about miasma being on it, just light some incense when you get home. And it doesn't need to be the fancy incense that you have to, the goddess Hecate. Just, light a little incense stick that you got from the dollar store too. And pray Psalm 23 as the incense burns, and you hold the Bible over the incense. And that will be good enough. That will cleanse off any of that negativity. I know root workers, including myself, and I'm sure some people will consider this sacrilegious, but there are root workers who use, particularly the book of Psalms, who will rip pages out of the Bible and work those pages. There are workers who will burn those Psalm pages to ash, taking one of those books like, I can't even think of the name of it, but one of the Psalm magic books. And, let's say Psalm 55 is for reconciliation with your spouse. They will take that Psalm, burn it to ash, put some of it in a candle, put some of it in a mojo bag. Maybe they will sprinkle some by their front door, and they will pray that Psalm over it and burn whatever candle that Psalm magic book says to do beforehand, before they do things with the ash. And that is a way that they are carrying the energy of that Psalm and in the intention of that Psalm, which goes all the way back to antiquity. They're carrying that into the areas of their life where they need it to be. So printing them out online, just as good. Because like I said, especially if you come, I'm sure most Protestants will probably have a harder time burning pages of a Bible than a Catholic would, right? Just because those of us who come from a Protestant background, we're so Bible focused. So let me tell you, it's a little freeing to burn a page or two every now and then, just to, remind you not to be overly attached to the word, and to also remember that the word is neither God nor Jesus. It may point to them, it may say something about them, but it is not them. Because if we think that, then we start to get into idolatry. And neither God nor Jesus are contained within those printed words. That's just not. Even for the Jewish mystical traditions that speak of those Hebrew letters on some level being God, even if that's true, and I could agree to that, when you get your King James version, that's not the Hebrew text. That is the Hebrew text interpreted through King James and his cohort of interpreters for whatever political agenda that they had back in the day when they created the King James version of the Bible. So now we're already getting away from what the original text was anyway. You know what I mean? So really, it's a place where, the Bible can be worked with a number of different ways. Don't feel any limitations around that, because there really aren't any. Whatever limitations we have are the ones that we choose to put on it.
Speaking of this biblical context, can you share a little bit about this creation of the mojo hand or the mojo bag, and maybe Can you give us like an example for the listeners out there who might be hearing this for the first time? What could be the different curios and things in it? And then
Sure.
And then can you talk about sealing the mojo hand, which there's whiskey, there's cigar smoke, so many interesting things.
Absolutely. So, because I know I've said this a few times and didn't really say what the heck I was talking about. So a mojo hand, there's a whole bunch of other names for it. Toby, Jomo, Grigri, depending. It all depends on, your tradition, where you're learning it, what part of America you're learning it in. So there's a lot of varying mileage there. But generally speaking, a mojo is a cloth or leather, usually satchel, a small one, like nothing big. Inside of that, you would put herbs, roots, sometimes coins, sometimes bone, sometimes animal, like dried, preserved animal parts. And I'll get into what I mean by that. Sometimes you also will put in it Solomonic seals, or not just Solomonic, but ceremonial magic seals. That probably raised a few eyebrows, but there is a tradition of working with some of the seals within ceremonial magic along with hoodoo, because remember, one of the geniuses of African spirituality, so now not just Black American spirituality, but African spirituality generally, is that it has this ability to recognize power. So this is why even in the more traditional religions like Ifa, there's a lot of talk, especially these days, of Ifa being a pure tradition. And some people will even leave Lukumi or not even deal with Lukumi because they go to Ifa thinking that it's the pure tradition. But it's really not. There really is no such thing, because if you start digging into the history of Ifa, you learn pretty quickly that some of the Orishas that people worship and revere are not even from Nigeria. They're not native to the Nigerian people. They come from some other tribe somewhere else that either the Nigerians conquered or they encountered them, and for whatever reason, really connected with that particular nature spirit, nature force, and brought it into their Orisha-based traditions in Ifa. So when I learned that, I said, that's interesting. So same kind of idea. In Hoodoo, we don't create Nkisis anymore because Hoodoo doesn't really have the knowledge because of how things developed to do that. But really, for all intents and purposes, a mojo bag is an Nkisi. It is that Frankenstein creation where you're taking herbs, roots, coins, bones of an animal or even a person, which I'll get into in a minute, and you put all of that together, you pray over it. You might add a Solomonic seal that you also turn into a petition paper, meaning if I'm sick, I may put my name at the center of that seal and, write some things around the circle of the seal to that angel, let's say, and really appeal to that angel to help me be rid of the sickness, and then place that in the bag with healing herbs and roots, maybe an angelical root since I'm working with an angel. And maybe on the outside of the bag, I will stitch a coin to Archangel Raphael. And the seal would also be to Archangel Raphael. Then I'll take it through a short little empowerment. I'll read Psalms over it. As you said, Alex, I would probably offer the bag either tobacco, like loose tobacco, or smoke. If I'm comfortable with puffing up a cigarette or cigar, I would blow smoke on the bag, and then using whiskey or corn liquor or what's called moonshine. Moonshine is actually more traditional than whiskey because that was kind of the stuff that the slaves had access to, and in some cases were able to make before whiskey. Whiskey is more of the standard now. It's a lot easier to get than moonshine, but you can find moonshine if you make a little effort. I use both depending on what I have. And of course, if you have any issues with, addiction or health, you can adapt all of that too. You can adapt it. It's not like set in stone where those are the only ways to feed or empower a bag. I also tell people that if they don't want to smoke or have respiratory issues, just take some tobacco and rub it on the bag and put some inside of the mojo. That's the same effect. The same effect without exposing you to those health issues.
You mentioned too about, getting into different animal parts or human bones
Yes.
and things like that.
When you add those things, it's usually because you're really, really creating that mojo for a very specific purpose. So, for example, alligator claws, gator claws and teeth are used sometimes in a mojo that's more of a wealth and prosperity mojo or a gambling mojo. And the idea is that hand, that claw, is going to reach out and bring the money to you, especially if you're gambling. You want to have a good, strong gambling hand. So, you would put a claw or tooth in there. Of course, you do need to be careful about getting that from ethically sourced places. And most of the places I've seen will say something about that. So, so if that's important to you, definitely look out for that or ask. They shouldn't be offended if you ask that question. Then, of course, for a gambling mojo, you might put like a die in there or a domino, thing that represent luck and chance and fortune, coin, the $2 bill. Maybe that $2 bill you have the orris root wrapped around it or high John root, depending on what you're trying to do. There's a number of ways to slice it, and that's part of what you learn. Even if you take a course, you still have to be studying. It's good to have a few herbological books on hand, because what I also find is I have a working knowledge of what herbs do what, but I still need to sometimes go look stuff up because maybe I can't find that or I ran out. So I need to find another herb that corresponds to that issue. And so having those is helpful, even if they're from other traditions. Like Scott Cunningham, he has some good herbology books. And so sometimes I will look at those, if I really can't find a substitute, and I find them helpful.
For all of those listeners out there who might come from a ceremonial magic background or a lodge magic background, and maybe there's a really heavy emphasis on correspondence tables and very specific correspondences. What you're saying, Aaron, and correct me if I'm wrong, is just that with Hoodoo itself, one of the big themes, whether it's a mojo hand or candle working or herbology, it's having that extemporaneousness, working with what you have. I mean, there just seems to be this kind of beauty and poetry to Hoodoo about working with right where you are, right in the moment, that is just so refreshing.
Yeah, and as you just said, there's misperceptions all around. So I do know that people tend to misperceive ceremonial magic as something that is always complicated, time-consuming, resource-heavy, and expensive, all of which can be true. But I also know from studying that if you really work toward having an authentic connection with, let's say, Michael, Archangel Michael, Michael, you will and should eventually get to a point where you don't have to evoke him for 4 hours. But, you should have negotiated from day one, once you made that point of contact, to say, okay, great, I got you. So now let's talk, man, because I can't do this every time. So what do you need? What don't you need? Here's what I can do. Here's what I'm not going to do. What's the easier way for me to dial you up? Because I can't do this every time. And there's going to be times where I need you to respond right away. So tell me, how do I make that happen? How can I do that where I don't have to do 7 days of purification just to say hi to you? And, the spirit, Michael, should respond. He should be able to tell you a way to do that, because he sees your earnestness by the sacrifices that you made to contact him in the first place. That's one of the things that I got from Aaron. When you're earnest, they see the efforts you're making. That is true of all spirits. When they see the efforts you're making and something else is going on in your life where maybe you can't do all of that, they know what's going on. They know you're going through something, and they should still respond to you because they know you're not just being lazy or choosing not to do it. It's because you just don't have it in you in that moment because of whatever else is going on. And you should have already developed the relationship to a point where you know what you need to do to get a quick response. All that is to say, that's in ceremonial magic. It's just that the difference is, in ceremonial magic, you have to do all of that upfront work to get there. Whereas with Hoodoo, you go right for what you need. My thing is, what are you going to do when all your tools are at home and, you're in the middle of nowhere and you're at some restaurant somewhere and people are acting crazy by your table when you're just trying to eat in peace. I know somebody who just took some salt and pepper, prayed over it, and kind of got up and scattered it near where the problem people were. And within a few minutes, they all just got up and left. So this person knew how to work just those two herbs to get a result. Herbs and prayer, that's all they did. So I think you can do both. But I think that's really important to know how to do somehow, because the fact is we're not always going to have all of the tools and prayer books and everything else in front of us. Sometimes all we're going to have is ourselves, our voice, and maybe a couple of other things. And we got to figure out how to put those things together to generate what we need. And I feel like that's the beauty and power of Hoodoo and most folk traditions, is using what you have, what you know in the moment to generate a result that's usually a very concrete, practical result.
Speaking of those commonalities, one of the things that you emphasize a lot in the course too is in Hoodoo, there is an incredible importance of candle working and flame working. Can you share a little bit, again, some of the broad strokes about why is candle work and flame work so important in Hoodoo?
Great question. So I'll start with my take and then kind of work my way back. So my take is that candle/flame work is important because it is the way that we can build pressure on a condition or situation to change it over time. Historically, it wasn't actually done with candles. Because, you think back in the day, it was much more common for people of any sort in America to have oil lamps. But certainly for those who were enslaved, I think a candle was more of a privileged thing. Oil was used a lot more. So those first flame working were done with oil lamps. And honestly, in some ways, the oil lamp is more effective and safer because even with like a glass visual candle, they can crack. They can explode. I have bought candles, and I always look when I buy a glass candle to make sure that the wick is centered, because I had a number of horrendous experiences until I learned the hard way of what happens when they're not centered. But sometimes even when they look like they are, as it burns down, it can become uncentered. And so then it starts making the glass black, or it'll crack it, or like I said, it'll explode. So there are a number of issues and problems that you have to kind of watch out for with those. Whereas with a lamp, especially like a traditional oil lamp with an oil base and usually the glass cover top and all that, they're made to be relatively safe. But it's also a lot easier to refill those while the wick is still burning. So you can actually lift that compartment off, add more oil when you see it getting low, and keep your working going. So an oil lamp is really, really good for a kind of long-term, over the long haul for the working. So for example, if you're trying to get a loved one who's lost, maybe they're missing or got kidnapped or whatever, and you're trying to get them to return home, there are Hoodoo workings you can do for that, some of which rely on a candle. So I would, if it was a serious situation, I would probably create an oil lamp with that so that I could keep it burning continuously, but like a slow burn, so to speak, where the wax is not just burning in 7 days or less. Because the other problem is wax candles are getting more and more cheaply made by the day. They're not even usually made with real wax anymore. So for me, I have noticed a dramatic change in how quickly they burn and how quickly they burn down, as opposed to when I started doing all this stuff. So there's a number of reasons, and I'm not saying not to use candles. It really depends on what you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish. But they do have a very important place in Hoodoo. I would say that the way we work with candles and the amount of work we do with candles is probably not as traditional. It's probably a kind of modern thing that has changed over time. I would say learn to do both and then kind of go from there. Just let them both influence your practice, because you're going to need both at some point. You're definitely going to need both at some point. So I think it's best to learn both. And in my course, we do kind of do both. And even with lamps, there's different ways of creating a lamp as well. There's the fancy lamp that I talked about, but there's also lamps where you get a fireproof container put some oil in it, and, make a floating wick. And that's just as good.
To that point, Aaron, we have a listener question for you from Dorian, who is asking and saying, "Hi, Reverend Dr. Davis. I'm trying to make my own candles in my esoteric work, and it's a long process, but I'm getting there." And Dorian says, "My question is, can you, Reverend, share what it means to add herbs and curios to candle workings? Is there a specific technique that is used for all situations?"
There isn't one technique because, again, it depends on what you're using, what you're putting together, and how. For me, it's more like do's and don'ts. For example, I haven't done it in a while. I know how to do it. I know how to make my own candles kind of from the ground up. It's a lot of work to me to do that. It actually took me a while because nobody taught me how to do it. It just took me a while to figure out how to incorporate herbs and essential oil and coloring the wax, like all that stuff in one candle. Took me a while to figure it out because liquid wax, meaning when the wax is hot, like if you melted wax in a pan, like a double boiler or something, and then you pour it into a glass to make a candle, it doesn't work like you think it would. It doesn't, like when you put herbs. And I remember the first time I did this, I was like, really? When I put the herbs in, like the herbs don't like nicely settle into the candle, so it looks like the herbs are kind of evenly spaced, and they're all and it just all kind of sinks to the bottom. And I'm like, well, that's not helpful. But then by the time your candle burns down, there's going to be a bunch of herbs at the bottom, and then the whole thing's going to become a fiery inferno. So you have to figure out kind of with candles where with wax you don't even pour all the wax all at once. You have to like do it in stages depending on how big the candle is and the glass that it's in. You pour some in, you let it start to harden, you make holes in it, you pour some more in. Because if you don't do that, what happens is the candle will, like a cake, it will sink in different parts. So these are all things that I learned over time. So there were a lot of really disastrous candles that I made in the beginning. So it is a lot of work to build a candle from the ground up. For me, it's a lot easier to get like a glass vigil candle and get like a ice pick and just kind of bore holes into the top of the candle, kind of as far down as you can, and very carefully then add herbs and condition oils in that. You don't want to use plain essential oil, because I learned this one too, that when you just pour essential oil in and then you light that bad boy, the whole thing's going to light up. The whole thing is going to light up because it's like putting alcohol in a candle, and it's just going to poof. And not only will the wick light on fire, but the whole candle will light on fire. So you really have to mix it with a carrier oil and then kind of work with that. And the other mistake that a lot of beginners make is they will put too much stuff in and on the surface of the candle. So that also will contribute to a serious fire hazard, because as that stuff catches the lit flame of the wick, it'll start lighting up other areas of the candle, and pretty quickly, you've got a flamethrower. So you want to be careful with those things and ask a lot of questions of the person who you're learning from, because I'm sure they will be like me and probably tell you of all their, battle scars that they got from those first candles that they made or worked. But yeah, learn as much as you can, because the more tools for candle and flame work you have, the more options you have. And the more options you have for when you don't have all the pieces, but you've got enough to make one version of it, then you work with that.
To me, it's a reflection of someone such as yourself who is very experienced and who has walked the path and experimented and finding out what works and what doesn't. And that's just so inspirational, frankly.
And goofing up a lot along the way.
Those precious gems of learned experience. I think I know myself, and I'm sure many listeners could really learn from your amazing experiences too, because exactly, it's about not being afraid to get our fingers burned, literally and metaphorically.
Right. And that has happened to me before too. So
Reverend, too, you've mentioned as well about the incredible adaptability of Hoodoo. And also, as you mentioned, it's an authentically American tradition. And there aren't too many traditions that can really say that. And I think to that point, We have a listener question for you from Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is asking and saying, hello, Reverend. I have ancestral connections to the Pennsylvania Dutch Hexenmeisters and also in the Appalachian area. And many of those practices seem similar to Hoodoo in some cases. Very cool. Can you please, Reverend, share about Hoodoo's connections and cross-pollination with these other areas? Thank you.
Great question. So I'm actually in a class right now, kind of a small class about powwow. And it's very eye-opening for just the reasons your questioner said, because it does have a lot of parallels to Hoodoo, but it also has differences. For example, going with where we started, Alex, social location is very, very different. Those first German Americans definitely had their own struggle. And you can see it, because I actually said this in the class, but I mean, you can see it when you look at, I'll say, their sacred texts. So they have a book called The Long Lost Friend. And it actually had different titles depending on the period of time you're talking about. But The Long Lost Friend, if you crack that open and you look at the spells, charms, and workings that are in there, I would say 80 to 90% of them are health related, whether it's for people or animals. You know, getting rid of a flu, getting rid of a cough, excessive bleeding, swollen breasts, all kinds of stuff. But the majority of it is health related. So when I look at that with the eyes of being a root worker, it's obvious to me that those people back in the day were really struggling with a lot of health issues, which I can see, because if you spend any time on the East Coast, you know that it gets ridiculously cold and the winters can be very harsh, and that is not conducive to good health. But at the time that powwow came about, you know, we were also in a very different place in terms of our medicine, meaning our medical medicine. So as I'm learning in this class, the people really relied much more on faith and God and Jesus Christ and so forth to get them through those times, and using these folk methods and folk remedies, some of which are very legit. If you read it, it'll say, oh, do this, that for 7 days and it'll probably go away. Some of them are really crazy. And even people in the class say that, you know, some of the stuff is like, oh, no, that's super poisonous. I would not put that in my mouth. But that's what they knew at the time. Hoodoo is the same way. It became what it became out of the context of slavery. It became what it became, particularly around the medical herbology. It became those things because the slaves, by and large, did not have access to the Western American medicine. And medicine was very spurious at that point to begin with. You know, it wasn't great. But the African people had their knowledge and memory of what they already knew before they came here, and they adapted it when they came here. And that's how they were able to take care of each other. And this will kind of get me going off on a tangent, so I won't go far into it. But what I find particularly messed up is that when Western medicine in America wanted to legitimize itself, it did that by creating this idea of practicing with a license, and created the idea of licensing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but then what they did is they made it illegal for anybody else to practice without a license. So immediately overnight, that made root workers and other folk practitioners basically criminals. And if they were caught practicing, they would go to court. They would do jail time. So this is the primary reason why almost every store that sells any hoodoo, curio roots, so on and so forth, you know, the product will always say for entertainment purposes only. You know, it's not because they don't believe the stuff works. It's because they need to cover their butts. But back to the question, the two traditions have a lot of parallels, but they also diverge a fair bit to me. Powwow, as I'm understanding it, is much more Christian, much more God and Trinity focused. Matter of fact, a powwower has to ask you before working on you if you believe in the Trinity. And if you say no, it doesn't mean they won't work on you. But the understanding of powwow is that if they still choose to try on you, they call it, it may not work because you don't share that fundamental aspect of faith that is important to the way the medicine in that tradition works. Hoodoo does not have that kind of litmus test. There is no such thing in Hoodoo. I don't ask anybody what they believe before I work on them or do a working or whatever. It's just not, it's a different way of doing the work. Doesn't mean one's better than the other. There's just that limitation there. So I would say that powwow is really powerful for Christians, maybe Jews, maybe, but the Christian element is really strong. So it might even be comfortable for Jews or other Abrahamic people because it comes out of that context. It comes out of, even to this day, if you go to Pennsylvania, especially the rural parts of Pennsylvania, the Christian presence is strong there. Now, what's interesting is, like Hoodoo, despite that, there's a general open-mindedness in powwow because most of those German Christians, not all, but most of them were Protestants, and they came out of particular Protestant sects that were in some way oppressed or discriminated against, which is why they came to America in the first place. So they carried that memory of that into this country. And so that's why, like I said, if they try for you, if they do a working for you, they're still going to do it. Even if you say you don't believe in the Trinity or whatever, they'll still do it because you're coming to them. So I see there are places where they parallel, intersect, and places where they diverge quite a bit. They also are not particularly open to doing, there's no two-headed powwower. The closest thing they have to that is a hexenmeister. And that is a person who learns how to undo witchcraft. And in some cases, send it back to the person who did it. But in their belief system, even sending it back to the person who did it is a little risky for the hexenmeister. So that person has to have a really strong faith, have to really have their hand in God's hand, and really tend to their protections and keeping themselves, spiritually clean and all of that, which parallels somewhat in Hoodoo, but they definitely don't. Traditionally, they don't work the dark side, so to speak, because the whole point of the tradition is that it is a God-focused and in some ways God-fearing tradition. So you wouldn't do those things because they run the risk of exposing you to baneful forces that can create a lot of chaos in your life. But that's a real quick and dirty assessment. It is a beautiful tradition, as I'm learning. It is a beautiful tradition. I like it. It definitely still dovetails with some of the Christian aspects of who I am. And I can see utilizing that for people who would come from that more Christian background, who wouldn't be comfortable with certain things, but would be more comfortable with some of this as I and other people would explain it to them.
You mentioned earlier, Aaron, too, that one of the big things that Hoodoo is not is initiatory. It is right. Not an initiation-based practice. And so to that point, we have a listener question for you from Kisa, who is asking, why do voodoo and Santeria require initiation? Does initiation mean that they're more powerful? In other traditions like Hoodoo and ceremonial magic, there's no initiation and people can work independently to get results. Your thoughts on this would be very great, Reverend. Thank you.
Good question, Kisa. So I'm only talking about African traditional and derived tradition. There's a different answer if you start adding, for example, lodge magic, right? But within these indigenous traditions and others, initiation is important because, so using leukemia as an example, leukemia is not just about getting results through working magic in some way. It's not just about, hurting somebody that's hurting you. It's more about you as a human being walking into the destiny that you chose before you incarnated on this planet. The mythology, I'll use a word that people will recognize. The mythology in leukemia is before we came to Earth, we stood before God, our Egun, our ancestors and spirit guides, and Orisha. And there was a conversation going on between all those parties. And during that time, each of us chose, how we're going to be here, what we were going to experience, good and bad, who was going to be our guardian angel while we were here, which ancestors and ancestral spirits were going to walk more closely with us in this lifetime, all those different things. And then you come down here when you're born. And when you're born, you completely forget all of that. Complete, like there's a whole, too complicated to go into, but the process of being birthed from heaven to earth causes a forgetting of that information. So in most African tradition, most derived or traditional, the point of initiation is for you to remember. A beautiful version of this story is Malidoma Somé of Water and the Spirit. He wrote the book many years ago. God bless his soul. I was given that book as a gift. It took me a little while to get around to it, but when I started reading it, I couldn't put it down, and I read it in a day. That's how compelling the book is. But he shows in that book, because what happened to him is the French people, the French missionaries, were big in the part of the world where the Doggerry people were and are. And they literally were going and kidnapping kids from the villages and then taking them to basically Catholic Christian schools and indoctrinating them in Catholic ways and trying to strip them of all of their kind of indigenous identity, much like what happened here with slavery. But he had such a strong relationship to his grandfather. And I'm telling this story out because I think it's directly related to her question. He had such a strong relationship with his grandfather that even after his grandfather died and he was kidnapped and taken to this place, the spirit of his grandfather came to him and basically drove him out of that school. And he, by a miracle of God, I'll say, he wandered and found his way back to his village. But the problem was he was not initiated on any level. And he was way older. He was almost an adult chronologically, but he was still seen as a baby because he hadn't gone through any of the initiation that he was supposed to go through when he was a little child up to that point where he was almost a man. So he had to go through all that. And without spoiling it, he remembers who he is. He remembers who he is, and it changed his life. So that's the point. There's a death that happens with initiation. I can't go into what I mean by that, but there's in most indigenous systems, but especially the African ones, you're going to experience a death, and then you're going to rise knowing who you are. It's not like this thing that happens all at once, but the process of initiation does something to you where you come to understand who you are in this world. Hoodoo can't really offer you that. It's not, the technology isn't designed that way. And I think the pieces that were lost because of slavery took that away. So, you really have to find a traditional or derived indigenous tradition to experience that in whatever way it's meant for you. But you can totally practice hoodoo without any of that. It's not necessary. Indigenous ways are not the only way to experience that. I have friends that are in some of those lodge magical traditions, for example, and I know they have their own process of that I'm sure is very similar in many ways. I would encourage people to, start with where you're from, your social location, and explore what's in your own blood and go from there. And you'll find your way to it. She asked about more powerful. I don't see it in terms of more powerful, less powerful. It's more, I see it as two different, they're related, but they're ultimately two different technologies. Because so much of Hoodoo is about, survival and getting through, the day to day. But something like leukemia, while there is that aspect, this is more about, the higher path, the higher, almost like theurgy, to use language that other people might recognize more. It's more like a indigenous theurgy, that you're reaching for deity and deity reaches back. And in that process, there's a transformation that occurs that reorients your reality.
And all of these themes are tied into your course, Working the Roots, an Introduction to Rootwork. Can you tell us, Reverend, a little bit about the course and where people can sign up for it?
Sure. So for people wondering about it or interested in it, the course description and sign up is at the Blackthorn School website. And that website, the address is theblackthornschool, all one word, .com. And Blackthorn has an E on the end of it before you type out school. So it's TheBlackThorne, and then school, SCHOOL.com. And if you go there, you'll see all the courses, but you'll see the little thing for working the roots. And when you click on that, it gives you all the information, a little intro video from me, and then you actually see the 8-week course outline. So I'll go through that real quick. The first week, as we talked about, is about context, social location, talking about ethics. The second week gets largely into herbs and herbology. The third week is baths and cleansings of different sorts. Week 4 is the candle and flame workings. 5 is oils, sprays, powders, incense. So that's partially about how to make them, partially the understanding of them and how to make use of them in different ways. Week 6 is divination. So different forms, different tools, as well as the Bible. So some of what we've been talking about tonight, we talk about that and go even deeper. Different ways to work with the Bible, both the book of Psalms and other areas of the Bible. Week 7 is kind of an overview of the various spirits of Hoodoo, meaning spirits people work with or revere or acknowledge. And people will be particularly interested, I think, in the spirits of the boneyard, of the cemetery. There are many different kinds. And so we talk about them and how and when to work with those spirits, how to make payment to arrange for an agreement with any spirit there, and how to make sure you leave and really respect the protocols of the cemetery. And then the final week is, now that we've studied all of this, how do we put it together? What does it mean to be a root worker? Some case studies, which in those is kind of tying together all the previous weeks so that people can think about it and discuss it in the class forum and really continue the communal aspect. So it's not just taking a class, oh, you passed, okay, goodbye, but actually having a continued dialogue as a community. And then I will just say there are also some surprises at the end, but I'm not going to say what they are. You got to take the course to find out, but they're pretty cool. Some stuff that I have planned for the final week. What I would say to people is this gives you a strong foundation. It's not possible in one course, unless you want the course to take forever and ever, to teach you everything about being a root worker. This is the introductory course. I'm actually working on a part 2 that goes much deeper into some of the more advanced areas of Hoodoo and root work. I think that's going to be called Working the Spirit. You'll notice if you look online, the first course does not go into the more baneful aspects, and that's intentional. I want people to crawl before they can walk, and I don't want people to bite off more than they can chew. And you really need to have a strong foundation in these first 8 weeks of study and practice them a bit so that you know how to take care of yourself before you start engaging some of the stuff in the big pool. If you're not careful, you can get in over your head very, very quickly. But I promise you that the second course will bring you to a place where once you complete it, you will definitely be able to call yourself a root worker with the understanding, the tools, the know-how, and really even a spirit system. It's interesting. I asked myself the question of what would it have looked like if root workers back in the day had full access to the spiritual tradition that they did interact with, particularly around spirit conjuration. And so in the second course, we will answer that question. That's all I'll say. We'll answer that question in a really powerful way that I've not seen anyone else even look like they want to take a stab at it. And I'm kind of surprised that nobody has. That is going to be one of the several powerful pieces in the second course. I do need people to take the first because I need to feel confident that a person had that foundation that they can really build on. So between the two of them, it will create a very powerful practice for anyone. In a way, Alex, including a theurgic aspect too. I thought about that. I thought about, it is important. There could have been a way for that to happen in the past. And so, in the second course, I think I've created a way to do that too. So I'm excited about it. I'm excited about that potential, but I'm also really excited about the one that we're doing now, because I see that the way that the community of students is gathering and talking, and it's really encouraging. It's really encouraging.
We'll certainly keep our ear to the ground on any updates. And is there anything else that you'd like to share with listeners, either about maybe other projects that you're working on, or just about Hoodoo in general? Anything else that you'd like to leave listeners with?
No other projects that I can think of, because this stuff is keeping me pretty busy. But just a word of encouragement that don't let anybody tell you what you can and can't do, or even just look into. Be empowered to explore, because some of that drive within you to explore is probably the urging of your ancestors, and you may not even know it. They do that because they know that, we need different things to develop and become the people we've been made to be. But there are a lot of forces in the world and in our lives that can tell us otherwise. And more often than not, if you take a step back, you will recognize that a lot of the naysaying that sometimes goes on is because of other people's fears and insecurities, and even their negative life experiences, that have taught them certain things that may be helpful for them, but it's not something that applies to everybody. You can be who you want to be, no matter what anybody says. And Hoodoo is one of the ways that can get people there. As I said, it is a tradition that is vitally concerned about the health and well-being and cohesion of our most sacred relationships. So that's my hope for everybody. I've really, really enjoyed this conversation with you. And I hope that when people listen, they'll find things that are helpful for them in their journey.
Practitioner of Hoodoo, conjurer, root worker, and teacher of these traditions, Reverend Dr. Aaron Davis. Yeah, Aaron, thank you just so much for taking the time and sharing your wisdom on the podcast today.
You bet. Thank you too, brother. I really appreciate it.
Listeners, how awesome was that to get an in-depth look at the history and the meaning of Hoodoo from Reverend Dr. Aaron Davis, and also how this powerful spiritual practice has so many facets and adaptability. I mean, I can tell you that as someone who practices Solomonic magic from the grimoires, Aaron's course really connected the dots and cross-pollinations with ways to approach things like consecrating fire and working with herbs with in-depth herbology. It was so insightful, and the way that Aaron lays everything out makes it so easy to learn and ask questions. So definitely check out the links in the podcast and video description for Aaron's course through the Blackthorn School. Also, thanks to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon for your wonderful questions for Aaron. And Glitch Bottle has no sponsors or advertisers to support it. Literally only you, only listeners, support the podcast on Patreon and make it possible. So if you'd like to claim your rightful seat on the Glitch Bottle caravan and enjoy some extra perks and chats, please visit patreon.com/glitchbottle. And as always, you can listen to Glitch Bottle on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker.com, and Stitcher Radio. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.